Okay, so we're going to continue on with yesterday's lecture outline. I believe we stopped at this point. We talked about, this kind of coincides obviously with your map study, the coloring of Europe relative to the Central Powers, the neutral countries, as well as obviously the Allied powers. But Germany and Austria-Hungary are lined up together. The Ottoman Empire is kind of there. I mean, technically they are part of the Central Powers. Bulgaria as well. Now, Italy, I think I mentioned this yesterday, but Italy was kind of all three. Like they started off as an alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary, and part of the verbiage in the agreement was they are in an alliance until war breaks out, but there's a non-aggression pact within that agreement. So even though Italy was technically part of the Central Powers initially, they pulled out when war was declared. So they were neutral for a time period, and then they eventually joined the Allied powers. So when I graded your map studies, I didn't really worry about Italy so much. As far as the Allied powers, initially it was Russia, France, and Great Britain, and obviously Serbia, who initiated the war, or was part of the process that initiated the war, called the Triple Entente. And that remained that way until 1917, when Russia pulls out during their revolution, and then the United States joins in for a period of about a year, maybe a little more, before the war finally comes to an end. As I mentioned, Italy joins. I think 1915 is technically when Italy joined the Allies, although they really weren't that involved. So moving on to the war itself, as I mentioned, this fell here. They don't want to see me anyways. As I mentioned, Germany had already established a battle plan for this exact scenario back in the early 1900s, like 1907 or somewhere in there. They had initiated a war plan that would have them fighting against both France and Russia. The Russian-France alliance was established way back in the latter part of the 1890s. So Germany kind of knew that if there was some kind of a conflict that does break out, that they're going to have to fight against France and Russia. And the problem with that is a two-front war. You have France on their western border, you have Russia on their eastern border, and that's not a good situation. So they come up with a plan for that possibility. And the strategy basically was put into place as soon as the war breaks out. First, Germany tried to defeat French, it should be the French, by concentrating the majority of the troops on the Western Front. In other words, their first notion was to defeat the French. They felt they could do that in about a 6-week window. And the size of the Russian army in Germany's eyes would take a long time for them to mobilize. So in that 6-week window, when they are defeating the French, they have a relatively small force on the Eastern Front, kind of battling whatever Soviet or Russian forces are there, but the real Russian forces are still kind of scrambling around trying to get organized. And that was their plan, right? So defeat the French, get the French out of the war, then move over and battle the Russians. As I mentioned, they felt like a 6-week window was their window to defeat the French while the Russians are still in the process of mobilizing. And in theory, and on paper, it sounds like a plan, like it would be, as long as it's executed properly, it would work. The problem is it didn't work for a couple of reasons. Some of it, which was kind of maybe strategically, it was maybe a little bit flawed, but what they didn't take into account is the type of warfare that was going to erupt on the Western Front in France. It became a trench warfare where there was a battle of attrition, a war of attrition, just kind of wear out the other side, so to speak. Anytime either side mounted any kind of an aggressive attack, it would gather relatively minimizable type of land. You wouldn't be able to, gain substantial area because of the fact that, now you're fighting against machine guns, you're fighting against modern technology, uh, in battle strategies that were maybe a little bit archaic when you compare it to the type of weapons. So the old, put your bagnettes on your rifles and then move forward in a charge type of strategy wasn't going to work when you have machine guns mowing people down, left and right. So that's why the trenches were dug to kind of protect themselves from that type of, the trench warfare and the sheepland plan strategy didn't coincide. And so that 6 week window went away really quick. And the Germans found themselves in the exact situation they're trying to avoid, which was a two-front war. So you can see, as I mentioned, a little bit slow on my slides. I should have advanced it a little quicker, but there's the sheepland concept that was developed, kind of that encircling type of advancement into Germany, or from Germany into France through Belgium, which draws England into the war. And Belgium being a neutral country at that point. So really the whole success of the plan kind of falls away as the stalemate slows everything down. Obviously the Germans never are able to defeat the French. And so the war kind of falls into a kind of a grinding trench warfare, a lot of casualties, a lot of fatalities along the battle lines, not conducive to the old strategies of the late 1800s, which a lot of these military people were trained in. They weren't used to fighting against a modern war machine. America at this point is neutral. As a matter of fact, President Wilson, his candidacy for the 1916 election is that he was going to keep us out of war. And so even though that the United States was officially neutral, unofficially, it's difficult to remain neutral. You have, a situation where you have immigrants who had recently moved to the United States in the early part of the 1900s and maybe 1880s, 1890s, who are from obviously Europe, many from Germany, a significant amount from Germany. And so you have that, hey, my brother or my dad or, my uncles are fighting in the war, but I'm living here in the United States. I'm an American, but yet I'm still, German. I still have relatives there. So is that really neutral? I mean, obviously the government's position was neutrality, but the people, I'm sure, had some sides that they were, struggling with. Also, from an economic standpoint, even though, again, neutrality was the official policy, there was a significant amount of goods being shipped to primarily allied nations, primarily to Britain and France. So even though the United States was officially neutral, socially, emotionally, economically, they were kind of tied towards the Allies and not so much towards Germany. Matter of fact, exports to Germany had dwindled down to almost nothing by the time you get to the 1915s and early 1916s. There really wasn't a lot of goods being shipped off to Germany, and that really kind of kicks off the submarine warfare that Germany involves in, called unrestricted submarine warfare, where they started to attack U.S. ships that were suspected of carrying war goods, maybe not necessarily like tanks and jeeps and things, but armaments and ammunition, things of that sort. Anything that Germany could, consider to be an advantage for the Allies, German U-boats would seek those out and sink them, which is a act of war, especially obviously against a country that is technically neutral. You see there the picture that one of the famous instances of unrestricted submarine warfare was the sinking of the Lusitania, which was actually a British ship, but there was over 100 Americans on board that ship. And as a result of this and other American ships being sunk by German U-boats, there was a significant amount of public opinion starting to shift away from, the policy of isolationism or policy of neutrality, and, moving more towards U.S. involvement in the war. Now, the difference in World War I and World War II in terms of the United States entrance, number one, in World War II, obviously the Japanese initiated an attack on Pearl Harbor, and the next day, the United States declares war and they start to get mobilized, and 3 months later they're fighting. In World War I, it was kind of a slow process, a step-by-step process. First, there was the sinking of American ships, and then there was a kind of a botched communication that Germany had sent to Mexico that tried to persuade Mexico to attack the United States along the Texas, Arizona, New Mexico border, to occupy the United States so that the United States would not become invested in fighting in Europe. And Germany had said, hey, if we are victorious, then we will help you reacquire the lands that had been lost in the middle of the 1800s. That basically was Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of California. And the enticement for Mexico was they were going to get those lands back. Well, Mexico denied the offer, but more importantly, the telegram was intercepted by British intelligence and sent to the United States, saying, "Hey, look at," because obviously Britain wanted the United States to get involved to help out. So they say, "Hey, look at Germany's trying to initiate Mexican aggression against your country." So the Zimmerman telegram was another kind of one of those steps towards the United States entrance into World War I. By April 17th, with all these different situations, public pressure, unrestricted submarine warfare, the Zimmerman telegram, the Zimmerman note, whatever it was called, decidedly in April of 1917, the United States declares war on Germany, starts the mobilization process, which involved, obviously draft and training and so forth. Once they declared war in April, it took them a while before they actually engaged in warfare. It was the idea of General John Pershing, actually, hey, we're not going to go there and just throw our troops into battle. We're going to go there and train. We're going to make sure we're well prepared before we enter our troops into actual fighting. And U.S. troops is going to fight under U.S. leadership. We're not going to send our troops to fight under British or French rule. And that was kind of maybe a little sticking point between France, Great Britain, and the United States. France and Great Britain wanted the United States to come there and fight right away, and they needed help, obviously. But the United States, I think, smartly decided, hey, we're not going to put our soldiers in kind of a bad situation by putting them in a war they weren't prepared to fight. At the end of World War I comes about, you have a couple, significant events. Russia pulls out of the war in October of 1917, coinciding with the revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution. They negotiate a separate peace with Germany. They pull out of the war, which was a huge advantage for the Germans because now they're not fighting that two-front war that we talked about earlier. However, the United States now at this point, in late 1917, are now much more obviously actively involved in fighting, so that kind of balances the power out. In November of 1918, Austria-Hungary had kind of given up and surrendered, and Germany follows suit about a week or so later. So by November of 1918, Germany signs an armistice, which is an agreement not to fight, ending the fighting of World War I. Now, we'll get into the treaty in a different lecture, but I want to stop right there, and then we'll pick up either live in class with the ending of World War II relative to the treaty and what the treaty involved, because it was pretty substantial and made a huge impact on Europe during that time period.